Okay, hi there, and welcome to my 4.1 on ethical and legal considerations within sport and exercise science research. So, what is ethics? Ethics, as you can see by the definition here, is someone's moral principle that governs a person's behaviour or the conducting of an activity. So, for example, in a game of football, and a player on the opposite side goes down injured, do you kick the ball out of play or do you continue the game? So that is going to come down to your ethical decision on what you think is the right thing to do. Most of the time, people would have a similar ethical decision within their conscience. Legal is a lot more straightforward, in that there's no, it's a lot more black and white. So, um, you being legal, um, in that you just have to think of the legal considerations. So before you do anything, is it within the law? If it's not, you're obviously not allowed to do it. If it is, then you can go ahead and do it. Um, an example of where law would come into play during research is, for example, a VO2 max test, where the participant says they want to stop, but they are forced to keep going by the researcher. So this would be against the law because obviously the participant has a right to withdraw. So if they are forced to keep going, that has completely taken that right away from them, which is uh, against the law within the BASIS Code of Conduct. So how did this code of conduct come about? It started with the Nazis during World War II, during 1939 to 1945. The Nazis were conducting horrific and really unethical research on their prisoners of war. The reason they were doing these tests is because they wanted to test the limits of the human body in order to better improve the Nazi German soldiers. An example of one of these tests would be putting the prisoners into possibly freezing water and completely against their consent, to see how the human body would adapt to this drastic and fast temperature change. They would sometimes even do this until the prisoners were at a point of death, so they would push them that far that they could actually, a lot of them did actually die from their research. Um, the reasons the Nazis were able to conduct research like this is because at the time there was actually no law to state what they could and couldn't do within research. So what they were doing was technically legal. However, after the war finished and the Germans, of course, lost the war, Nuremberg looked at what the Nazis had done after it all came out and said straight away it was unethical and something needs to be done about it so nothing like that can happen ever again. Um, and so he came up with the Nuremberg Law. Within this law, it was basically setting boundaries for research, ethically and legally. So an example would be where the participants within the research have to give informed consent and they should, by law, have the right to withdraw. So, informed consent, they would tell the person or maybe sign a form to say to the researcher that they have the go ahead to do the research on them. And that is their choice. They have chosen to do that. They have not been forced or bribed or deceived or anything like that. Um, and also, they have a right to withdraw. So, even though they do give this informed consent, they also have a right to withdraw at any point during the research. So, whether it's halfway through, whether it's at the start, whether it's at the end, they can withdraw whenever they want. Um, and these laws also apply to the researcher. So an example of where these laws applied to researcher is that they would have to not hide any results from their research. So if they're trying to prove a point and some data came out that they perhaps didn't like or didn't go according to their data, um, they are not going to be able to hide that and just forget it about it because it would be within against the law. So some significant theorists. Zimbrado, he was the head um, researcher of the product in 1970 project in 1971 called the Stanford Prison Experiment. The aim of the experiment was to test and collect what the effects of prison life, being a prisoner and being a guard, had on perfectly normal school students. Half of them were given the role of a guard, half of them were given the role of a prisoner, and it was to test the psychology, how far they could push each other, and it ended up being completely not what they expected because the guards completely took charge and treated the other prisoners horribly and forced them to do humiliating things. Um, and if they didn't do it, they obviously could do what they want because it was their prison within the university campus. So they were treating them horribly. Some problems with the research was that it involved serious harm at times to the serious emotional and physical harm to the prisoners because they were being treated so horribly. Another problem was that before the research even happened, um, the students were offered $15 a week for or $15 a day for this for taking part in this project, which at the time was a lot more than it would be now. So they were completely bribed into it. About 75 students signed up and 25 were chosen. So they really wanted that money. Um, so by the end of it, these students who were the prisoners ended up being completely obedient to what the guards were telling them to do, simply because the guards were in charge and the prisoners were the prisoners, and it was a successful test, but it was the ethics of the test that was questioned. So here is Milgram. Milgram's research project was a test of the human brain on how much harm a human being could bring themselves to cause to another human being. So basically, the person was taking a test and they were told, so they were deceived and told that it was a meta test of memory. And if they got the sequence wrong, like a Simon Says sequence type thing, then they would have to send a gradually increasing voltage of electricity to the person who they thought was on the other side of the wall. However, there wasn't actually someone on the other side of the wall. It was a recording of someone screaming in pain at this increasing voltage, and the person who was pressing the button to send the charge thought it was a real person. Um, so, sorry. The footage of the test shows that some participants were trying to tell the person behind them that they did not want to do the test anymore. They were hurt. They could hear they were hurting the person on the other side, and there were videos where they were saying they didn't want to kill the person, and but because there was someone standing there of high authority who was leading the research, telling them, "You must do this. You must do this in order for the research to be successful. Otherwise, it's all pointless," type of thing. The participants felt that they just had to do it, so it got to the point where almost all of them sent an amount of voltage that could kill a human being. Um, there are some really unethical things about this test in that they were completely deceived. They were being forced against their will by someone of authority when they did, because this was post Nuremberg Plan, they did actually have a right to withdraw, but they were just being forced to stay on. So going back to the sports science side of research, the main organisation is BASES. So they have lots of ethics committees and they've created their own code of conduct. So it stands for British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences. Um, their role is whenever a sports scientist wants to conduct some research, it must be put through BASES first. Here, a BASES employee will analyse things such as a risk-benefit analysis and will eventually come back to the researcher and will say whether they can do the research or not, or maybe they can do the research but they can't do that part of the research and will alter it for them. So my first created scenario, the effects of continuous altitude training on someone under 18. In my opinion, this scenario is ethically correct because as long as the altitude is not that high to then do serious harm to the participant, it would be okay because they're not going to. It's not like they're climbing up to the highest mountain where the oxygen is that thin. However, I do think that if the person is under 18, it might be dangerous if they've never been in that sort of environment before being pushed to do that sort of training. the ethical considerations. It's going to be needed ethical clearance within an ethics committee within bases. It's also going to need an analysis on if the volunteer is going to be harmed physically or emotionally. So risk benefit analysis. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? If so, the research can take place. The volunteer is obviously going to have their right to withdraw, and no deception can take place. So they've got to know everything that's going on all the time. The legal considerations, they will have to do a health and medical screening questionnaire just so they know about any illnesses or conditions. They should have a full disclaimer, so they should know, again, everything that's going on by law. And there should also be data protection. So if the data, like the data has to be confidential and it has to be protected, so it can't just be shared to the public for anyone to access in case because of privacy. The consequences of not acting within these ethical and legal considerations would be, for example, not doing a health and medical screening questionnaire could result in a fine. It could result in a prison sentence, or BASES accreditation completely stripped, taken away. So my second scenario, the effect of negative feedback on missed football penalties in training from all of the coaching staff. So ethically, I don't think this scenario is very correct because it involves completely negative feedback, not constructive feedback, completely negative, telling them that it was bad and so on, and no positives. This I feel could cause real harm emotionally to someone, especially if they're younger, because obviously you're a bit more vulnerable when you're younger, maybe under the age of 15. So that could really affect someone in their confidence within the sport. The ethical and legal considerations for this is that it would again have to go through an ethics committee, have ethical clearance so the research can take place, and then it will need a risk benefit analysis. Again, do the benefits outweigh the risks? If so, go ahead with the research. There's going to have to be informed consent from the volunteer, and for example, if the volunteer is below the age of 18, it's going to need parental permission as well, informed consent from them. They're going to have a right to withdraw, obviously. A risk assessment of the training ground where it's going to take place, so no like divots in the pitch where they're about to get the ball in case of like ankle injury sort of thing, and and they've got to be volunteers as well. So they've got to be someone who's maybe seen it on an ad and have just done it out of their own choice without any bribing or deception, and also equality. So say if there are 3 people doing the test, they've all got to be, even though they're not being treated very well, they've got to be treated the same. So no one's going to have a harsher punishment than the others. The consequence of not doing any of this is that again the research could lose the BASES accreditation, and they may even be put on an ethical training course for this sort of test going wrong, because obviously it does the point of the test is to see what negative feedback affects, how it affects people. They could also be sued and taken to court, maybe by the parents, and then they could even go to prison from that. So scenario 3, the effects of creatine on a 1 rep max squat. I think that this scenario is correct because it involves research that could really cause a big breakthrough if the supplement proves to work. The ethical and legal considerations. It's going to need a medical and health screening questionnaire in case the product could be harmful to someone's allergies. A lifestyle questionnaire again, so if the product is going to affect them in the way they live their life, they're going to have a right to withdraw, a disclaimer, there's no deception can take place, the data has to be protected, and it's also got to be volunteers, so no bribing. A risk benefit analysis, so could the squat hurt them, but could they benefit out of it? And then it's going to involve the researcher responsibility to make sure everything goes well and that they know exactly what they're doing when doing the squat. And again, if any of this didn't happen, then the researcher could go to prison or lose their BASES accreditation.